Good evening. Welcome to The View Up Here. I am your host, Canadian Glenn, and it is July 24th, 2019. Tonight on the show, blowing hundreds of millions of tax dollars to own the Libs. Canada's federal election nears, and we have never seen this current level of collusion between the federal and provincial conservative-based political parties. On many fronts, with corporate press assistance, there is a common narrative, but it is not credible to oppose the suggested targets of the overall campaign. At first, things like the constitutional challenge to the policy of federal carbon pricing seemed legitimate, if somewhat overdramatic. Coincidentally, it was only conservative-based governments elected since the federal win by the Liberals in 2015 that are pursuing this strategy. And it's been given little chance of success by constitutional experts, and so far those experts have been proven correct. First, the Saskatchewan Court of Appeal ruled that Ottawa is within their jurisdictional authority to impose a federal price on carbon. The exact same exercise continues on in Ontario. This litigation for show was not recommended to the Manitoba government after assessment. New Brunswick stands with their blue buddies ready to intervene on their behalf wherever and whenever necessary. But enter the ringleader, Jason Kenney in Alberta, fresh off electoral victory and ready to fight for the sake of fighting on anything not a conservative idea. Yes, this will go to the Supreme Court, and yes, it will be defeated. Piles of money will be wasted on a lost cause. Why? Now we've progressed into refusals to negotiate agreements between Ottawa and provincial capitals, which is preventing funding of programs that benefit all Canadians. Of course, the narrative is it's the Libs' fault. Finger-pointing abounds, as expected, with zero progress. Now, some say the end goal may be to defeat the Liberals this October, and then a promised land for the conservative ideology would present itself. The possibility of meeting the impossible formula to amend the Canadian Constitution, 7 plus 50, 2/3 of the provinces, and 50% of the population plus 1. Well, 10 provinces, 6 and 2/3, that's 7. So that is a dark goal when people talk about what's going on with the Conservatives and their coordinated boundary crossing. It's the Libs, own the Libs. That's not a pretty picture. But, nothing's ever goes quite as smoothly as planned. Now, what I'm going to start with is Saskatchewan in this issue. They've been there from the start. They make a lot of noise. And I'm going to go back to last October 3rd, 2018. This is from Liam Richards in the Saskatoon Star-Phoenix. And Saskatchewan and the federal government to announce an infrastructure deal worth nearly $1 billion. Now, the provincial and federal governments plan to announce a funding agreement worth almost $1 billion, ending Saskatchewan's holdout as the last province to sign a deal. Federal Infrastructure Minister François-Philippe Champagne and Gord Wyant, the provincial minister responsible for Sask Builds, are set to announce the agreement in Regina. Saskatchewan is the last province to ink a bilateral agreement with Ottawa to obtain funds from the Federal Investing in Canada plan, which is expected to pay the provinces about $180 billion over the next 11 years. Now, the province's previously proposed share of the pot includes $460 million for green infrastructure projects, almost $308 million for public transit, and almost $116 million for rural and northern projects, and $56 million for recreational projects. Details of the finalized agreement were not available at the signing. Now, Wyant, whose portfolio includes the Crown Corporation responsible for managing major infrastructure projects, told the Saskatoon Star-Phoenix previously that he was confident he would be able to commit to signing a deal within about 2 weeks. His comments came after Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who just happened to be in Saskatoon for the Liberal Party's caucus retreat. Trudeau said, "The only thing we're waiting for is for the province to actually step up and sign the agreement." Wyant subsequently told the Star-Phoenix that was unfair because the provincial government have never said it would not ink a deal with Ottawa and was just holding out for greater flexibility on how some of the money is distributed. Okay, time out. So you're the last in Canada to sign a deal, and you think with your population of 1 million people is going to get leverage? Nice try. So, I mean, this stuff's been going on for a while. That was last October, before the carbon tax was even in effect federally. So now we go to February 12th. Saskatchewan did launch their appeal to the Saskatchewan Court of Queen's bench on the constitutionality of the carbon tax. So this is from February 12th. This was in the Financial Post. This was a guest editorial opinion piece from Premier Scott Moe. This was right before court really got anywhere. This week, the government of Saskatchewan will have our day in court against Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's imposition of the carbon tax. As Premier, it's my responsibility to stand up for Saskatchewan people. The parents driving their kids to the rink or dance practice, our farmers and ranchers working to feed the world, our small business owners looking to serve our communities, and everyone heating their homes during our frigid winters. Trudeau's carbon tax will make all of these tasks more expensive without significantly reducing emissions. Worse yet, Trudeau's carbon tax is unconstitutional and fails to respect the sovereignty and autonomy of provinces for matters that fall within our jurisdiction. Trudeau's proposal violates the principles of federalism, spelled out in Canada's Constitution, by selectively applying the carbon tax on provinces where a federal benchmark is not met. Constitutionally, Ottawa could decide to impose a national carbon tax similar to the GST, applied uniformly across all provinces. Instead, it has violated the Constitution by selectively applying the carbon tax across our nation. By this same logic, this flawed taxation power would give the federal government the ability to impose a provincial sales tax on a province that doesn't have one, like Alberta, or create a new tax just for one province. Here's a spoiler. This is nuts. This is legal bullshit. The federal government's proposal also applies detailed emission limits for various industries, including heavy oil upgraders, steel manufacturers, and potash mines. In other words, the last three big industrial employers Saskatchewan has. These regulations encroach on the provincial responsibility of regulating these industries. As is our jurisdiction, Saskatchewan has put forward our own comprehensive, innovative climate change plan. The plan, called Prairie Resilience, will reduce emissions from the electricity sector by 40% and reduce methane emissions from the oil and gas sector by 40% by 2030. Under this plan, our industries remain competitive and are not subjugated to the damaging effects of a carbon tax. So you're going to enforce the rules that are already there. Keep in mind that a lot of the emissions reduced from electricity, because Saskatchewan is pretty much completely coal dependent, is because of guidelines Harper put in. Saskatchewan is serious about tackling emissions, and we recognize that global greenhouse gas emissions will continue to rise without innovation and action. We need not look further than our industries that are already innovating and working towards solutions. Our agriculture industry sequesters nearly 12 million tons of CO2 annually, with zero-till farming technology already in use on more than 70% of our agricultural land. We are working to significantly increase our renewable electrical generating capacity, and our world-leading carbon capture and storage project at Boundary Dam 3 has prevented more than 2 million tons of carbon dioxide from entering our atmosphere. Okay, hold on. Let's just back up here for a second. He says that the agriculture industry sequesters 12 million tons of CO2 annually. The Boundary 3 carbon capture debacle has cost more than $2 billion, and that project has prevented 2 million tons as long as it's been running. This is where your plan is? Stuff like this? Saskatchewan is joined by Ontario, Manitoba, and New Brunswick in opposition to this tax, which just happen to be the 4 provinces where the tax is. And an Angus Reid Institute poll showed Saskatchewan has strong support for our decision to take the Trudeau government to court. 88% of people in Saskatchewan and 72% of all Canadians support our government's decision to fight the carbon tax in court. Almost 2/3 of Canadians also said they believe provinces should have the final say on carbon pricing and not be forced to take Ottawa's plan. Well, then come up with a real plan. While lawyers and judges gather in a courtroom in Saskatchewan this week, the majority of Canadians that oppose a carbon tax will be watching. There are some, like Saskatchewan's opposition NDP, who call our court challenge of the carbon tax a pointless crusade and believe we should simply give in to the federal government's demands. To them, I say our province will never stand down in our opposition to the Trudeau carbon tax. There is just too much to lose. Oh, that is outstanding boilerplate. But did Scott Moe himself write that? Yeah, somehow I doubt it. My opinion, I don't believe Mr. Moe has that sort of oratory capability to compose and deliver such. Being my opinion, of course. Now we go to May 31st. So that was February 12th. Yeah, we're going to court. We're going to kick ass. May 31st. This is from Canadian Press. The Saskatchewan government has filed notice that it is taking its challenge of the federal carbon tax to the Supreme Court of Canada. Justice Minister Don Morgan said the province will ask the High Court to rule on whether the tax is constitutional and whether Ottawa has the jurisdiction to impose it. Saskatchewan's Court of Appeal ruled in a split decision earlier this month that the tax is constitutional. It also said that establishing minimum national standards for a price on greenhouse gas emissions falls under federal jurisdiction. Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe, who has said the tax hurts his province economically, promised there would be an appeal. Justice Minister of Saskatchewan Morgan said the province has 2 months to file a factum to the Supreme Court of Canada. Our government will continue to stand up for Saskatchewan's people against what we believe is an unconstitutional tax on their families, communities, and businesses. He added that if the Liberals lose the federal election in October, there may be no federal tax left to fight. the Conservatives have promised to scrap the tax. Okay, see, here we are at the end of May. They're starting to work it in already. The Supreme Court could say it's moot. It's not worth hearing because the government has changed the law. Or they could say, no, this is a matter of importance. We want to create a precedent. A government spokesperson said in an email that the province does not have to ask for a leave to appeal in this case. That's true. The federal tax has been imposed on provinces that have not implemented their own carbon plans: Ontario, New Brunswick, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. Ontario and Manitoba are also fighting the federal tax in court, and Alberta has said it will join the battle. Alberta Premier Jason Kenney's government officially killed the province's carbon tax in UCP Bill 1. Federal Environment Minister Catherine McKenna said Ottawa's tax would be imposed on the province soon. Kenney said that Alberta had not yet received a formal notice from the federal government on the imposition of the tax. If and when we receive that, I will instruct our lawyers to proceed with filing a judicial reference to the Alberta Court of Appeal. Are you seeing a pattern yet at all? Time goes on, election gets closer, more guys join the fight, same playbook. But before we finish on Saskatchewan dealing with the Liberals specifically and Ottawa, this is from June 4th. This is from CTV in Saskatoon. François Biber. Millions at stake in Saskatchewan-Ottawa legal fight over uranium mine cleanup. So, keep in mind that in public, the Saskatchewan Party government of Scott Moe is all, yeah, fuck Ottawa, we're standing up for everybody. Well, yeah, no way, we're not collecting money, we don't want money, just leave us alone. And then look what they're doing here in this case. The province of Saskatchewan is suing the federal government for its share of the cleanup costs of what used to be the world's largest uranium mine. Saskatchewan has spent $135 million so far, with total costs estimated at $280 million. The federal government has spent $1 million, according to Bronwyn Eyre, Saskatchewan's Minister of Energy and Natural Resources. I think any fair observer looking at that information would say that it's not fair, said the minister. The Gunnar Mine, located 25 kilometers south of Uranium City, near Lake Athabasca, began as an open-pit uranium mine in 1954. It operated underground between 1957 and 1963. The site was a self-contained community with more than 80 structures, including an indoor mall, a bowling alley, school, and hospital. When the mine ceased operations in 1963, that's only 9 years that this mine was open. Remember that. When the mine ceased operations in 1963, it released 4.4 million tons of tailings into the environment and 2.7 million cubic meters of waste rock, according to the province. Now, on September 22nd, 2006, the federal and provincial governments signed a memorandum of agreement to address the decommissioning and reclamation of Gunnar Mine in a collaborative and equitable manner, according to the province of Saskatchewan's statement of claim. The governments were to split the cost of the project, then estimated at $24.6 million. 13 years later, the cost has ballooned to an estimated $280 million, as the province demolished the structures from the Gunnar community, all of which were built with asbestos insulation, and is now partnering with the Saskatchewan Research Council to clean up the 5 million tons of tailings. In a statement of claim, the province says the Gunnar Mine was federally regulated when it was established in 1954, and Ottawa did not impose any decommissioning or reclamation criteria once the mine ceased operations. The province claims the continued contamination resulting from the Gunner Mine site presents a risk of radiation exposure, not only to the human population of northern Saskatchewan, but also to fish, birds, animals, and plants in the region. Now, the agreement from 2006 stated that discussions would need to happen if costs were to escalate beyond the $24.6 million estimate. And the province says they have made repeated efforts to have those discussions. Minister Ayers said they have fallen on deaf ears. And on the other hand, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission has ordered us, with threat of a fine, to do all this work and agrees with what we're doing. So on penalty of fine, we've been told to keep doing the work, and Natural Resources Canada hasn't paid us for the work that the CNSC has ordered us to do. That seems irrational at best. I assume the government agrees with its own federal regulator. In its statement of claim, the province seeks $11.17 million in compensation for the initial share of the project, when the estimate was $24.6. The province also wants an additional $50.6 million for Ottawa's share of the remediation costs to date. Now, the federal government claims in its statement of defense that Saskatchewan has failed to manage the cleanup of the Gunner Mine in a timely and responsible manner, breaching the agreement. Saskatchewan incurred significant and unnecessary cost overruns and failed to provide financial reporting. And Ottawa repeatedly offered to enter into an amended agreement that would trigger Canada's further funding obligations, but Saskatchewan neglected to do so, according to the feds. The statement of defense also claims Gunner Mine was operated and closed under Saskatchewan's provincial mining regulations, and it was Saskatchewan's responsibility to impose decommissioning and reclamation criteria. The federal government says the 2006 agreement capped each side's funding at $12.3 million and does not require equal cost sharing regardless of the work done to incur them. So, you have to stop and think. If Scott Moe would have a real climate plan of his own, or say, fine, we don't have one, we will accept the federal backstop, do you think the feds would be holding this $60 million in court over him so hard? This is just such a futile waste of resources from every side. These stupid politics. Speaking of stupid politics, I now turn to Ontario in this collusion. This is something from August of 2018 in the National Observer by Fatma Sayed and Mike D'Souza, who has just left the National Observer and moved on to, of all places, Global. May God help you. Doug Ford's Ontario pursues doomed plan to stop Trudeau government's efforts to fight climate change. Ontario Premier Doug Ford's progressive conservative government says it will ask the courts to stop Prime Minister Trudeau's efforts to fight climate change. At a news conference, two of Ford's senior cabinet ministers said they had filed papers at the Ontario Court of Appeal to challenge the constitutionality of the federal government setting rules in place to require polluters to pay. The ministers, at this time, Attorney General Caroline Mulroney and Environment Minister Rod Phillips, called the federal policy a job-killing carbon tax that was unethical and unfair. Now, under Canada's Constitution and Canadian law, the federal government has a right to impose taxes as well as to regulate substances that are considered to be toxic. Constitutional law experts have previously told National Observer that Ford's plan is likely doomed. The Trudeau government has said it would use its powers as part of a national strategy to fight climate change and honor Canada's international commitments, supported by all political parties under the 2015 Paris Agreement. The federal carbon tax will have its day in court, but it's already on trial among the families who will be forced to pay more for gas, home heating, and everything else if the federal government gets its way, said Mulroney, who previously supported a plan to tax carbon emissions under former Progressive Conservative leader Patrick Brown. Phillips, who was also part of the PC team supporting Brown's efforts to tax carbon, said that Trudeau should cancel the carbon tax. The Ontario government said it was setting aside up to $30 million for the legal fight, but Mulroney said she doesn't think it'll cost that much. How refreshing. Federal Environment Minister Catherine McKenna didn't waste any time before slamming the Ontario announcement as proof that Ford's government, along with opposition leader Andrew Scheer's federal Conservatives, have no credible plan to fight climate change and support economic growth. Our kids deserve better, McKenna said in the first of a flurry of tweets. The Ford government is cutting money that helps hospitals, schools, cities, and families improve their energy efficiency, and instead is spending $30 million of taxpayer money opposing climate action. Emissions are dropping. The economy is growing, McKenna said. Since we were elected, Canadians have created over 500,000 jobs. That's 60% more than the Harper Conservatives in the same time. A plan for the environment, a plan for the economy. Wow. So, I mean, even at this point, the battle lines are drawn. It seems the Liberals recognize, okay, all you blue bastards are against us. Fine, let's play ball. At the time, Attorney General Mulroney also said the province was joining Saskatchewan's legal challenge against the federal carbon pricing plan. Yeah, that's working out great. The federal government's imposed carbon tax will devastate economies across Canada, said Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe on Twitter. It's time to let the provinces decide for themselves what works best on climate. Critics, including members of the Trudeau government, have suggested that Ontario and Saskatchewan are taking this position because they don't want to do anything to address the economic and environmental threats posed by climate change. This action by the Ford government will be the first constitutional challenge by the Ontario government in 30 years. The Ford government is taking the position that the carbon tax is unconstitutional, and second, that the federal government does not have the power to impose the tax. The exact same wording Saskatchewan used, the exact same wording that they were defeated on. Why is it going to be any different there? Members of Ontario's three major parties in opposition strongly criticized the legal challenge, calling it a waste of money. This government has no hesitation of messaging with an election happening in the city of Toronto and then saying the federal government doesn't have the right to use the constitutional rights it has, said Peter Tabuns, the NDP critic for energy. Tabuns said Mulroney conveyed zero confidence in her announcement of the legal challenge. She doesn't think she's going to win. Anyone who can read knows that this case is more than likely going to lose. She has no confidence in it. She knows it's just a political tool. Ontario Green Party leader Mike Schreiner called it a frivolous lawsuit. The government is more interested in spending money on lawyers than they are in repairing schools, helping hospitals lower their utility bills, or helping people save money by saving energy. Ontario Liberal Party leader John Fraser as well said the legal challenge was a fruitless exercise in an effort to wage a fight against the federal Liberals. We can't afford the basic income pilot, but we can afford to toss $30 million away on a very questionable constitutional challenge that no other province except Saskatchewan is joining. Well, that was at that point. That was in 2018. The Ford government has gone harder, faster than any other province in dismantling as much as they possibly can as far as environmental legislation goes. This is from January 26th of this year, 2019. Doug Ford government loses attempt to quash cap-and-trade lawsuit. This is from EcoJustice, the law firm representing the litigants. The Ford government's attempt to dismiss a court case against them, brought by Greenpeace Canada, represented by EcoJustice, has failed. The organizations filed a lawsuit against the Government of Ontario for unlawfully failing to consult the public when it ended Ontario's cap-and-trade program. In early January, the government brought a motion to stop the case, arguing that there was no point in proceeding because the regulation to revoke cap-and-trade is no longer in force. I can't believe you having the balls to go before this court and say you can't punish us on a law that we eliminated. That's wow. The court rejected this argument and said the case should proceed. Keith Stewart, senior energy strategist with Greenpeace Canada, said, "We are eager for Doug Ford's government to have to answer for their actions over cap and trade, and glad that Greenpeace will get our day in court to protect the environment and Ontarians' democratic rights. This is an important reminder that not even Doug Ford is above the law." Professor Amir Ataran, lawyer for the EcoJustice University of Ottawa Environmental Law Clinic, said, "The Ford government broke the law when it illegally failed to consult the public. We're going to court to remind Premier Ford that winning an election does not give his government carte blanche to ignore the legal rights of Ontarians to be consulted on major changes to the laws and regulations that protect them from climate change. Doug Ford's attempt to stifle this lawsuit has failed. And not only that, the decision on the motion contained a suggestion that his government's actions were illegal, and it may be necessary to prohibit them from doing something similar in the future. If the court finds that the cap and trade was eradicated in an improper way, it will mean that the first action that Doug Ford and his ministers took on their first day in office was illegal." So, and they just go over the timeline a bit. It was July 3rd, 2018, when the cabinet changed an Ontario regulation which revoked cap and trade, just like that. A regulation in cabinet did it. On July 25th, after that, they introduced Bill 4, the Cap and Trade Cancellation Act, in order to just completely get it all off the books. And that's where the lawsuit comes from, where there was no consultation with a legal duty to do so. And that's that. And that's still going through the court. That is not over at all. Now we get to this thing again, the same point, just like Saskatchewan saying, well, we need all this money for this goddamn uranium mine. Well, Doug Ford, because he's Doug Ford, wants to completely rewrite Southern Ontario's public mass transportation issues for, the fourth time in 20 years. None of them have ever been fully implemented and stop. Here's another one. This is from April 10th. This is from the Hamilton Spectator. This was upon the announcement of Doug Ford's what's been called napkin plan for mass transit in Southern Ontario, specifically Toronto. This is from Sean Jeffords in the Hamilton Spectator. Doug Ford's ambitious plan for public transit in Ontario includes a Toronto downtown relief line that will be twice as long as the city is currently considering, be built 2 years earlier, and cost billions more. The Toronto subway system expansion was one of 4 projects, part of a $28.5 billion plan the Progressive Conservative government said will move the province's aging public transit into the 21st century. The province will contribute $11.2 billion to the project, and Ford said he hopes the federal government, the City of Toronto, and York Region will chip in the rest. There has to be responsibility with the federal government. Last time I checked, they have a lot of members where these subways are going. Last time I checked, the mayor, his responsibility is to get the city moving. It's just my opinion that if you want that type of cooperation to work, that type of buy-in, then maybe you should involve them when you make your plan, you stupid ass. But there is no love lost between Ford and the federal Liberal government, who he is taking to court over the carbon tax. His relations with Toronto Mayor John Tory has also been tense since the government slashed the size of City Council in half shortly after winning a majority government last year, and especially after Ford promised to upload responsibility for Toronto's subway system, including all future projects, to the province. If need be, we'll backstop it ourselves, Ford said, when asked what would happen if the other levels of government refused to help fund his plan. Federal Finance Minister Bill Morneau would not commit to contributing to the Ford government's transit plan, criticizing the province for dragging its feet when it comes to allocating federal infrastructure money. We have already put significant funding in place, and we've found it difficult to actually get these projects going because the Ontario government is not at the table trying to get these projects to happen. Adam Vaughan, a federal Liberal MP who represents a downtown Toronto riding and sparred with Ford during their days on Toronto City Council, called the plan bizarre. Well, it's really nice to see that he's taking a crayon to the riding I represent and somehow feathered a subway line through the densest, most complex part of the city of Toronto with absolutely no costing, no idea how it's going to work. The Ford government said Toronto's new 15-kilometer relief line that would run from Ontario Place in the city's west to the Ontario Science Centre in the east. The city's proposed line instead would be 7.5 kilometers long and run from the subway line on Danforth Avenue to the line on University Avenue. The province said it can deliver the project by 2027, 2 years earlier than the city's projections, using standalone technology and a different procurement method. Oh yeah. The project would cost $10.9 billion, up from the city's $7.2 billion estimate for its version of the relief line. Toronto Mayor John Tory, who did not attend the announcement, said the city must continue to work with the province and cannot walk away from transit planning in spite of serious questions about timing of the projects and funding that he said remained unanswered. No mayor, no premier, no prime minister can build transit alone. But one mayor, one premier, or one prime minister can easily block transit progress. That is why we have to try to work together. Now, Ford's government plan also includes 3 other key projects. The Yonge North subway extension that will cost $5.6 billion and be completed in 2029-2030. The $4.7 billion Eglinton Crosstown West extension LRT line to be finished by 2031. And the infamous Scarborough subway extension, which will move from having 1 stop to 3 stops. The province said the project will cost $5.5 billion and will be completed by 2030. Wow. What was it? The first time the Scarborough subway extension came up, it was like $2 billion, and people were shitting their pants on that, and now it's 5.5? Wow. So, I mean, you know, everybody, no, we don't want to pay nothing. Forget it. We're not paying nothing. Hey, why don't you give us some money? Oh, these conservatives, they're such awesome managers of the economy. How many times have you heard that? April 13th of this year, this is from the University of Toronto paper, The Varsity. This is written by Madeline Kelly. This is an opinion piece in the university paper, UT. Ontario budget's climate change plan, a mess of contradictions and inaction. The Ontario government's frivolous $30 million lawsuit against the federal government over the carbon tax is a self-inflicted wound that the provincial 2019 budget announced April 11th fails to address. Doug Ford's government claims that the implementation of a carbon tax on Ontario would be ineffective, result in job losses, and be bad for business. However, he brought this tax on the province when he chose to scrap the cap-and-trade program, which aimed to hold industry directly accountable instead of putting the onus on consumers. In lieu of clarification on the carbon tax, or the binned cap-and-trade model, the budget vaguely outlines a performance-based emissions reduction program that it expects will circumvent implementation of the impending carbon tax. The program entails developing and setting emissions performance standards sector to sector and assessing reductions according to the previous output of facilities. This will be buttressed by the creation of an emissions reduction fund meant to incentivize industries to adopt cost-effective projects in various sectors, such as transportation, with no mention of investments of any kind in renewable energy. Ironically, the budget states that performance standards will be tough but fair, cost-effective, and flexible, as if tough and flexible are not antonyms. Initiatives like these may not result in substantial emissions reductions because preceding enforcement, industry can ramp up their emissions in order to be held to a lower bar, what they would have normally been producing when the time comes to eventually reduce their output. Green Party of Ontario leader Mike Schreiner told the Varsity that the proposed plan mirrors the failing emissions reduction mechanism currently operating in Australia, which has a much larger budget of about $1.9 billion compared to the $400 million emission reduction fund proposed in the provincial budget. Ford is fear-mongering about job losses when, in reality, Ontario has had a good year of job growth overall. And despite the carbon tax in British Columbia working for years, they don't seem to be having many problems. Whether Ford likes it or not, the federal government is within its rights to impose a federal tax according to the distribution of powers outlined in Section 91 of the Constitution Act. The taxpayer-funded money used to fight the carbon tax will be wasted in a frivolous lawsuit. Lastly, it is worth noting the province has based its emissions targets on the federal government's, which was grandfathered in from the Stephen Harper era and does not comply with the Paris Agreement. Their target of reducing emission levels by 30% compared to 2005 by 2030 is not nearly aggressive enough to curtail catastrophic repercussions as forewarned by the IPCC Fifth Assessment Report. As Schreiner said in his address to the press during the budget lockup, it is clear that this budget cares about the price of everything and the value of nothing. Evidence from a lot of different places that this is bullshit. But somehow they don't seem to be in the corporate press. Again, the fight over money carries on. April 16th. This is Sean Jeffords, Canadian Press. Ford government won't work with federal Liberals on building projects, says Trudeau. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau accused Ontario's progressive conservative government of dragging its feet on vital infrastructure spending and says the indecision endangers work for the summer construction season. Trudeau criticized Premier Doug Ford's government during a funding announcement at a tech hub in Kitchener, saying the provincial Tories are refusing to work with the federal Liberals. He said his government has been patient with the province and urged it to allocate money that the federal government had set aside based on an agreement with the previous Ontario Liberals. We've been highlighting this behind closed doors and privately to them that they really need to flow this money, the Prime Minister said. I am now saying it very publicly. The provincial government in Ontario is letting down Ontarians and is going to be missing this construction season if they don't come to the table and show us what projects they want to partner on with us. Trudeau's comments mark the latest flare-up in the increasingly acrimonious relationship between the provincial and federal governments, which has seen both sides trade barbs on issues ranging from carbon pricing to immigration. Notice how the media plays it up there. Oh yeah, they're both doing it. Nobody's at fault here. They're both doing it. No mention of how it gets started or details. Sorry, forget it. Whatever. Last week, when this was written, Ford announced a $28.5 billion plan for 4 transit projects in the Toronto area, but said the province would only cover $11.2 billion of those costs, with the feds expected to pitch in for a share. There has to be a responsibility with the federal government, Ford said. Ontario Infrastructure Minister Monty McNaughton said the government began to review all spending commitments after taking office last summer. McNaughton said the 2 levels of government have been holding ongoing discussions about infrastructure funding, but slammed Trudeau for his most recent remarks. We understand the federal government has an election to worry about, but we don't answer to the Justin Trudeau re-election campaign. Yeah, we know, Monty, you answer to the Andrew Scheer election campaign. Wow, projection. In the federal budget, earlier in 2019, the Liberal government provided a one-time $2.2 billion windfall to help Canadian cities improve roads, bridges, highways, and water systems. Finance Minister Bill Morneau positioned the funding as an end-around on 4 provinces, naming Ontario, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and New Brunswick, and said it was done because those governments don't always cooperate. So there you go. Now, you have to question that. Is it worth pissing Ottawa off when they give a backdoor to cities to get money directly from the feds for what they want to build and what they can use as contributions where the province wants one from the city? So talk about who's buying votes by taking a political stand. How is Doug Ford winning in this? At this point in time, how do you think GTA and the City of Toronto are going to vote in October? Do you see much change from what there is now? I don't. And hey, it's the GTA and it's the City of Toronto. There are more seats in the City of Toronto than Alberta, basically. GTA, there's more than Alberta. And Ford thinks this is helping. Whatever. June 3rd. This is by Ben Spur in Toronto Star. The province says it wants federal money for the Ontario line. Ottawa says it needs more answers. The feud between Ontario's progressive conservative government and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's Liberals escalated further, with both sides accusing the other of playing political games to block funding for major Toronto transit projects. At a news conference at Queen's Park, Ontario Infrastructure Minister Monty McNaughton and Transportation Minister Jeff Yurek urged Ottawa to step up and commit conditional funding for the Ontario line, the $10.9 billion transit project Premier Doug Ford unilaterally announced 2 months ago. The proposed 15-kilometer line through the heart of Toronto is one of 4 projects Ford has pitched as part of a $28.5 billion expansion of the GTA's rail network that would replace the city's previously council-approved plans. McNaughton said he was concerned Trudeau found it more politically expedient to engage of a war of words with the province than to actually fund new projects. Prime Minister Trudeau wants to pick a fight. Instead, he should pick up a shovel. McNaughton called on Trudeau to, quite frankly, put his money where his mouth is and approve these projects so the people of Ontario can benefit. Yurek said Toronto transit users are tired of being stuck on overcrowded vehicles, and the province was committed to working with the city to get the Ontario line built. Remember that one. We'll come to that. Now it's time for our federal partner to commit their support, and it's in all of Ontario's interest to get more cars off the road with better transit. This news conference followed remarks Trudeau made at a gathering of the Federation of Canadian Municipalities in Quebec City, in which he accused provincial politicians of going out of their way to block federal funding for infrastructure projects just to score political points. In an email to the Star, Brooke Simpson, a spokesperson for Canada's Minister of Infrastructure and Communities, François-Philippe Champagne, said the Ford government hasn't provided Ottawa the necessary information about the Ontario line and other projects for them to win federal approval. As Ministers McNaughton and Urick well know, real applications and business cases are needed in order to get federal approval, and we hope they follow up soon. We are not in the business of writing blank checks with public funds when so many questions remain to be answered as to how the funds will be used. Simpson disputed the minister's assertion that the federal government has committed funding to transit projects in other parts of the country that were at similar levels of planning as the Ontario line. McNaughton and Urick cited an extension of Vancouver's Millennium Line in NDP-governed British Columbia that has received federal support. But Simpson said in that case, the province submitted complete business cases to support its funding proposal. This is exactly how the process should work under these bilateral agreements, and we encourage the Ontario government to formally submit complete transit project applications, as BC did. The Ontario line would replace city plans for a relief line subway. Like the earlier version, the Ontario line is intended to take pressure off the Toronto Transit Commission's overcrowded Line 1, but it would be roughly twice as long as the 7.4-kilometer first phase of the relief line and would connect the Ontario Science Centre to the vicinity of Ontario Place. The Ford government says it could build the Ontario line by 2027, at least 2 years sooner than the projected opening of the relief line, by constructing it above ground in some sections and using smaller trains than traditional subways. Little design work has been done on the line to date, and cost and schedule estimates have yet to be finalized. A city report released this week stated the conceptual plans the province has presented for the Ontario line have some positive aspects, but municipal staff would need to assess the project further before making a recommendation to council about whether to endorse it. A report is expected back by the end of this year. The Ford government says it wants the federal government to pay up to 40% of the cost, or about $4.4 billion, while also asking Ottawa to provide the same share for the other three projects in Ontario's plan: Yonge North, three-stop Scarborough subway extension, and the Eglinton West LRT, for a total of up to $11.4 billion. Now for the carrot and stick part of this. Despite the provincial minister's comments, correspondence obtained by the Star suggests that behind the scenes, the federal government has signaled it would be open to providing funding for Ontario transit projects before detailed plans are finalized. A letter dated April 30th, 2019, from the Federal Deputy Minister of Infrastructure to her provincial counterpart stated that in the event that approval of federal funding is required before a final business case can be developed, the Government of Canada could provide money for projects through a stage gate process. Under this phased process, Ottawa would help pay to advance a provincial project's design and make funding to build new lines contingent on future submission of a full business case. In the letter, the federal government posted more than 24 questions to the province about the readiness of the Ford government's proposed transit projects, and requested responses to allow Infrastructure Canada officials to determine an approximate timeline for approval. That's being out-governed. We're willing to give you guarantees. We're willing to end the myth that we're not going to fund you. But you have to answer all these questions. And you know they don't have the answers. The questions, which resemble a list of 61 the City of Toronto put to the province in April about Ford's transit plans, seek basic information, such as how long it will take to finalize full or preliminary business cases for projects, how the province's proposed projects meet policy objectives, and how Queen's Park calculated its cost. A spokesperson for McNaughton said the province wrote back and stated its intention to prepare initial business cases for its priority transit projects by the end of June. I haven't heard if they've come out. When the Premier unveiled his new GTA transit map in April, he pledged the Ontario government would shoulder the full cost of the $28.5 billion plan if no other levels of government came forward. Minister Jurek said that hasn't changed, but argued there's no reason Liberal MPs shouldn't support the Ontario line. Their own constituents are going to benefit from this investment. Yeah, we committed to hang ourselves, and now we're trying to make it sound like you can't do that. Now, as I said with the quote in the previous article about, everything's going just hunky-dory with the city. June 19th, from CP24, Chris Fox. City has paused planning work on relief line that can't also be used for the Ontario line. The city has halted most of its planning and design work on the relief subway line in the wake of the province unveiling a substantially different vision for the project. In January, Mayor John Tory announced $325 million in funding over 2 years to accelerate work on the relief subway line. But with Premier Doug Ford's government now pursuing a parallel vision for the line as part of a $28.5 billion plan to build transit in Toronto, much of that work has been put on hold. Speaking with members of council during a council meeting, the TTC's acting chief transit expansion officer, Gary Downey, revealed that all work on the relief line that can't also be used for the Ford government's Ontario line has been suspended. We have actually scaled back what we are doing to ensure we're not wasting money at this point in time. The design work we are actually carrying out now is work that won't be wasted going forward. So information that can be used on both the relief line and the Ontario line. City Council has not endorsed the Ontario line, and the relief subway is technically still a part of those plans. That line would begin at Osgood Station, travel along Queen and Eastern Avenue before turning north at Carlaw Avenue and connecting with Line 2 at Danforth. Ford's proposed Ontario line, meanwhile, would run from Ontario Place to the Ontario Science Centre. On Tuesday, Downey said the planning and design work on the relief subway line had reached about 15% completion and was scheduled to reach a critical point in which financial estimates become more reliable by early 2020. Planning and design work on the Ontario line is believed to be at less than 2% completion. He said that right now staff are continuing with a study of soil conditions in some areas where both the relief line and Ontario line would pass, but have to put other work on hold. TTC Chief Executive Officer Rick Leary also confirmed that the city will be seeking compensation from the province for the millions of dollars in planning and design work on the relief subway that may no longer be of use. The city had previously pegged the value of that work at $15.4 million. Yeah, sounds like you're getting along great with the city of Toronto. Holy shit, Queen's Park is in the middle of Toronto. It's what, 6 blocks from City Hall? Give me a break. Wow. What is the point of all this obstruction? Who does it help? The last people it helps are the taxpayers. Get shit done. Now we turn to New Brunswick. This is from December 5th. of last year. CTV Atlantic Bureau Kevin Bissett, New Brunswick launching its own carbon tax challenge and making a new emissions plan. New Brunswick Premier Blaine Higgs says he's committed to meeting and exceeding Ottawa's emission targets, but is expanding his province's fight against the federal carbon tax. In November, the new PC government announced it will intervene in legal challenges launched by Saskatchewan and Ontario. But now Higgs says New Brunswick will also launch its own legal challenge of the carbon tax. Let's spend some more money. He said the proposed federal backstop puts New Brunswick at a disadvantage, and if it remains in place, New Brunswickers will be paying the country's highest tax on gasoline by 2022. Well, go talk to your former employer, the Irvings, who make all the gasoline. We believe the federal government's carbon tax unfairly targets New Brunswick businesses, Irving, and is too heavy a financial burden for ordinary residents who need to heat their homes in the winter and drive their cars to where they need to go. Higgs said his government will endorse the recommendations of the New Brunswick Climate Change Action Plan, released 2 years ago, and will develop regulations to deal with large industrial emitters. Irving. At this point, it's unknown what those regulations will say, but Higgs insists they will work. Well, yeah. The commitment is that we will not allow our targets not to be met. Every industry needs to understand that we have a goal that we've set for 2030. Lois Corbett, Executive Director of the Conservation Council of New Brunswick, said she's glad the government is endorsing the action plan, but says it is weakening the targets. She said the target of reducing emissions to 14.1 megatons by 2030 in New Brunswick is about 4 megatons more than a previous target. And she worries when government talks about developing a made in New Brunswick solution. Will they be weaker than those on an oil refinery in Montreal or Ireland or not? Green leader and leader of the opposition, David Kuhn, said the court challenges will fail and be a complete waste of taxpayers' money. He said Higgs could have simply waited for the outcome of the challenges by the other provinces. Kathy Rogers, the Liberal environment critic, said the court challenge is irresponsible and calls a carbon plan with no apparent source of funding just rhetoric. Unless you're putting a price on carbon and changing behavior and holding those who emit the most more responsible, then there is just no way to fund initiatives. So that's an even more specious reason for joining this fight. From March 28, 2019, Michael Tutton, the Canadian Press, Trudeau slams New Brunswick's stance on the federal carbon levy. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau slammed New Brunswick for its opposition to the federal carbon levy, saying conservative governments across the country don't think that fighting climate change is a priority. Trudeau made the comments in New Brunswick, one of 4 provinces where the federal carbon pricing backstop takes effect next week. That would be April 1st this year. During a stop at the Garcelon Civic Center in St. Stephen, Trudeau told reporters there needs to be a price on pollution. I regret that the government of New Brunswick doesn't think that putting a price on pollution is important. It's the 21st century. We know climate change is real. We know that one of the challenges we have is that pollution has been free. We need to put a price on it. Ottawa has promised to return all the funds collected in rebates to individuals, businesses, local governments, and other organizations. We're doing that in a way at tax time. New Brunswickers are going to be able to get money directly back, which will more than cover for the vast majority of families any extra expenses attached to the new price on pollution. It's a shame that the conservative governments, not just here but across the country, don't think that fighting climate change is a priority. But I know New Brunswickers and indeed Canadians know that we have to do it if we're going to keep our economy strong into the future. Now, see, that's a very strong, very natural counter position. It does nationalize more, but being the federal government, that's your purview. And that, again, is why the provincial opposition stick to their borders. It works for them. It works at home. Canada, the federal government, has a bigger home. But I don't see the benefit. What are they getting out of this? What is the profit? You know, they're basing it all on one very narrow result. But just to finish this off, in a news release earlier in the month, New Brunswick Energy and Resource Development Minister Mike Holland was critical of the carbon levy. Any new tax, especially a carbon tax, that will make everything you buy more expensive is not the best approach to change behaviors and will only add unnecessary costs that hurt the economy and negatively affect New Brunswick families. Blah, 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 blah. April 1st, Globe and Mail, Janice Dixon. This falls under this category because of where it happened. Again, this is on Carbon Tax Day, April 1st. Federal and provincial conservatives launch campaign fighting federally imposed carbon tax in 4 provinces. Federal and provincial conservatives are waging a campaign attacking the government's carbon tax that came into effect on 4 provinces on April 1st, vowing to fight the initiative they say will make life more expensive. Now, the federal Tories actually stepped into this campaign at the end of March. They have been using radio ads, sending text messages, using targeted social media ads, and door-to-door canvassing to tell voters that the Conservative Party is committed to scrapping the carbon tax. Conservative leader Andrew Scheer told reporters in New Brunswick that his party sent text messages to voters living in the 4 provinces affected, saying they had one final opportunity to fill up the tank before the cost of gas increased. As of April 1st, the Liberal government's carbon tax took effect in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, and New Brunswick, the 4 provinces that do not have their own pricing plan. The tax kicks in at $20 for each ton of carbon dioxide emissions associated with the fuel, rising to $50 a ton by 2022. It's expected to immediately add 4.5 cents on a liter of gasoline and 5.5 cents on diesel, rising to 2022 to 11.6 cents and 13.7 cents. The federal Liberals have vowed to return every dollar back to the province from which it's collected. About 90% of the revenue will be directed back to households through a payment that will be delivered annually through individuals' income tax returns. Mr. Scheer, Ontario Premier Doug Ford, and most of Ontario's MPPs posted photos of themselves filling up their gas tanks over the weekend. Oh yeah, wasn't that awesome? Said Premier Ford, the Prime Minister tells us that the carbon tax will be good for us. But then I sit back and say, really? Why should anybody believe what he says anymore? Doug Ford said, why should anybody believe what somebody else says? Wow. The truth is clear. You can be for a carbon tax or you can be for jobs, but you can't be for both. Okay, Dougie. Mr. Ford's government is also expected to spend millions on taxpayer-funded ads, also attacking the carbon tax. Yeah, the pump stickers. We have to protect the people of Ontario. We're going to use every tool at our disposal. Holy Christ. And, of course, New Brunswick Premier Blaine Higgs got on the tweet storm with that, too. So did Scott Moe. Everybody played ball. Meanwhile, out of Ottawa, Environment Minister Catherine McKenna simply tweeted that it's no longer free to pollute anywhere in Canada. Have you ever seen this sort of collusion between all the different political conservative parties before against the federal government? Never. Does it remind you of anything? Yeah, we'll get to that. Now we move to Alberta. May 2nd. This is from Chris Varco in the Calgary Herald. As promised, Alberta's Energy Fight Club steps into the ring. The first rule about Alberta's new Energy Fight Club is that you always talk about Fight Club. In fact, you talk about Fight Club even if you're not actually fighting, although you do have to be prepared to throw verbal punches when necessary. It didn't take long for Jason Kenney to change the tone at the top of Alberta's government toward energy policy and relations with the rest of Canada. His UCP government made good on a campaign promise to proclaim legislation passed by the Notley government last year that allows Alberta to restrict energy exports to other provinces. That is known as Bill 12. Through the use of licenses to export oil and gas from Alberta, the new premier can reduce petroleum shipments to other jurisdictions if the legislation withstands a legal challenge launched by British Columbia. The bill is directed at BC Premier John Horgan and threatens to propel pump prices in that province even higher after the Victoria government's persistent attempts to derail the Trans Mountain expansion. Kenney went out of his way to stress he's not going to use the powers immediately. However, the stick is there. This is not some bluff. We are prepared to use tools like this if there is ongoing obstruction. Alberta's premier spoke with Horgan and plans to follow up with a face-to-face meeting. Diplomacy will come first, but Alberta's Energy Fight Club has officially begun. Next up, Bill C-69 and C-48, along with foreign sources of funding for anti-oil sands groups. For many players in the embattled oil patch, as Calgary Herald here, they're pleased to see a more aggressive posture from the province to defend Canadian energy development. He's doing something. He's not just waving his arms, and he's not leaving it in Justin Trudeau's hands, Surge Energy CEO Paul Colborne said. I'm excited about the tougher stance because I believe it will show people that we're not going to be patsies. We're going to stand up for our industry, and he's going to championship for all Albertans. Industry leaders welcome Kenney's vow to challenge the constitutionality of the federal oil tanker ban off BC's northern coast, also known as Bill C-48. Producers, not the industry, not Alberta Energy, not anything, producers are also satisfied to see the Premier intends to challenge the legality of Bill C-69, the proposed Federal Impact Assessment Act within it, which will change the way major energy projects are reviewed by Ottawa. Jason has to come in with guns hot, said Whitecap Resources CEO Grant Fagerheim. Reasonable heads will prevail, but I think you have to put people on alert to say this is not the way Albertans are going to be treated any longer. Integrated petroleum producers were more circumspect about the province proclaiming Bill 12, although generally supportive of its aims. Imperial Oil and Husky Energy both said they understood the rationale for the legislation, but hope a solution will be found to avoid its use. Similarly, Seven Generations Energy CEO Marty Proctor believes cooperation and collaboration will prevail. But Proctor noted BC's Premier recently lamented the high price for gasoline in the Lower Mainland, and Horgan doesn't want Alberta to wield the power to restrict energy shipments heading west. Yet the BC government has attempted to block the Trans Mountain expansion, slowing the industry's ability to send more refined petroleum products to BC consumers. Well, that's just bullshit, flat out. All the refined products that BC gets is through the existing 60-year-old pipeline. It's got SFA to do with TMX. According to the BC government's own documents, about 55% of its gasoline and 71% of its diesel is imported from Alberta, primarily through the federally owned pipeline it's trying to stop from expanding. These aren't the only energy battles ahead for Alberta's new government. Kenney has yet to pivot to the planned inquiry into foreign funding of anti-energy groups, but it's coming. Well, it's here now. He's set to appear at Senate committee hearings on Bill C-69. Yes, he did. The feds announced last week, for this would be at the end of April, that in situ oil sands projects will be included on the list of energy developments placed under future federal review if Alberta's cap on greenhouse emissions from the oil sands is lifted. So you want to talk about who's got the stick here? If you remove Notley's 100 megaton cap, then we will federally review all in situ oil sand projects. That's a big stick. And of course, what's the immediate response to that? Kenney suggested he doesn't intend to remove the emission ceiling anytime soon, although having Ottawa raise the prospect of a federal review on thermal oil sands projects is another reason to adopt a combative stance. The federal government has zero constitutional authority to Bigfoot in here and pretend they can regulate in situ oil sands developments. Well, yeah, they can. Talking tough doesn't mean you're going to win, particularly if you end up before a judge arguing over jurisdictional issues like the division of federal and provincial powers. Court cases and challenges have their own level of messiness and uncertainty. What's certain is Jason Kenney, as promised, is now scrapping on multiple energy fronts. But as the Premier moves through his first week on the job, he shouldn't overlook one of the forgotten rules from the movie Fight Club. Fights will go on as long as they have to. In other words, these battles could drag on for months or years, and the new government's fight-back plan has only just begun. And that brings us to earlier this week, June 20th, Edmonton Journal, Emma Graney. See you in courts. Alberta government launches federal carbon tax challenge. Justice Minister Doug Schweitzer said he believes the move of the federal government imposing the backstop carbon tax on Alberta constitutes federal overreach into the right of the province to manage its own affairs. Imposing a federal carbon tax on Albertans constitutes federal interference with our constitutional authority to make policy decisions within our own jurisdiction. That's a new twist. Doesn't sound any better based to me, but at least it's something new. The constitutional reference has implications beyond the carbon tax that every Canadian should be concerned about. Oh, that's the angle. Okay. Although the federal government hasn't yet officially unveiled its concrete carbon tax plan for Alberta, Schweitzer argued signals out of Ottawa that it will go ahead with a backstop program makes this the right time to head to court. We need to take action now to make sure we defend Alberta's interests. Yeah, before the October election. Yeah. During the Alberta election, Jason Kenney promised a UCP government would launch a formal court challenge of the federal carbon tax by the end of April. That didn't happen. Kenney recently said his government would await legal decisions from Saskatchewan and Ontario before Alberta heads to court. But he's obviously decided to go ahead instead. The Saskatchewan government recently lost a court challenge against the federal carbon tax and vowed to take its battle to the Supreme Court. Schweitzer said it's important for Alberta to get ahead of that ruling and table a full evidentiary record in front of the court as soon as possible to make sure we can hopefully have this heard prior to any Supreme Court rulings on the matter. As for a timeline, Schweitzer is hopeful the Alberta Court of Appeal will allow an expedited hearing. I think the earliest date for a hearing would be sometime in October. Schweitzer is expecting this case to cost around $300,000. He said he didn't want to get into the details of the legal briefs and how Alberta's arguments would differ from Saskatchewan's losing case. We're going to fight for the future of Alberta. Wow. So they're going to go for the overall jurisdictional authority, but I don't see where it's got any legs to stand on at all. It's specious, whatever. And I like the importance on getting precedent established. It's like, no, we can't allow this to sit before Supreme Court before we get going, because then whatever we do is subject. We want one last crack. We'll take our chances with an Alberta Court of Appeal to get the precedent altered before it goes to the Supreme Court. Now, as I mentioned in the show description now, there's funding agreements for all kinds of different things now. And as the weeks go on, as the months go on of these new conservative provincial governments and all the austerity and the job losses and the gifts to those who are benefactors of the conservative governments, there's more and more opening for the federal Liberals to do end-arounds and try and get money to things that need money, that the provinces do not want to deliver for political purpose. So that brings me to July 19th, Charlie Pinkerton in iPolitics. This is about the money that somehow at the end of the day seems to matter more than the bluster. Ontario, Saskatchewan, and New Brunswick agree to the Fed's carbon tax school spending plan. Manitoba rejects it. The provincial governments of Ontario, Saskatchewan, and New Brunswick have all agreed in principle to how the federal government wants to spend a portion of the new tax on carbon-emitting products like gasoline and diesel. Manitoba, though, says it won't accept the funding, with Premier Brian Pallister on Thursday telling local media the plan was a hoax. Federal Environment Minister Catherine McKenna announced last month that the federal government planned to put 3% of this year's carbon tax revenues towards projects that make schools more energy efficient, like installing better lighting, heating and cooling systems, or more efficient windows. The government's carbon tax, which the Trudeau Liberals passed into law and put into action at the start of 2019, is only applied in provinces which don't have an emissions-based levy that is up to the par of its own. The federal government's legislation states that all revenues must return to the jurisdiction where they were collected. 90% of the funds are promised to directly return to consumers through an offsetting tax rebate. The remaining 10% is dedicated to help municipalities, hospitals, universities, schools, and small and medium-sized businesses to become more energy efficient. The federal government decided that 3%, which is an estimated $60 million of total proceeds, would help retrofit schools in Ontario, Saskatchewan, New Brunswick, and Manitoba, the provinces where the federal levy is collected this year. When she announced the federal government's intention in June, McKenna asked for a formal response from the provinces by July 19th. iPolitics confirmed that the environment ministers of Ontario, Saskatchewan, and New Brunswick each wrote McKenna telling her they accepted her proposal, but that they each had concerns or additional questions about the plan. I am writing to confirm that our government agrees in principle to redistributing these funds back to Ontario school boards, subject to any necessary internal approvals. That said, it is our position that the funds generated by the carbon tax should never have been taken from Ontario schools, families, and businesses in the first place, wrote Ontario Environment Minister Jeff Urick. Yeah, we'll take the money, but you never should have took it. We are accepting the funding commitment in principle, but there are some details to be worked out. Ann Moores, a spokesperson for New Brunswick's Department of Environment, said, "Our government has agreed to enter negotiations to receive the funding to ensure the proceeds of the tax that were levied in Saskatchewan stay in Saskatchewan," Matthew Glover, a spokesperson for Saskatchewan's government, said in an email. Paul Hamnett, another spokesperson for Saskatchewan's government, said over the phone that there's a lot to be worked out between the province and the federal government, specifically regarding cost coverage. In her pitch to the provinces, McKenna proposed a cap on energy-efficient upgrades costs at 40%. While McKenna says in an appendix of her letter that there is no requirement for provincial governments to match the federal funding, Glover said that funding for these upgrades will inevitably come out of the budget that school boards receive from the provincial governments. We want money. No, we're not willing to contribute money. Comes out of your existing money. This tax should have never been collected, but we'll still take the money. The federal government projects that Ontario schools will receive $41 million. Saskatchewan schools will receive $12 million, and New Brunswick schools will receive $2 million to contribute towards retrofit projects. Manitoba schools were expected to receive $5 million under the plan, but Pallister accused the federal government of overreaching into provincial areas of responsibility. We're already doing leading green architecture on our schools and building a record number. We really don't think this is how a country should be run. So no, the feds want to have a PR campaign to promote the carbon tax, and they're on their own. In a statement sent to iPolitics by email, Minister McKenna said Pallister was playing politics. It is disappointing that Mr. Pallister has decided to reject money to help Manitoba schools fight climate change, become more energy efficient, and save money. She maintained that the carbon tax revenues would be given back to Manitoba and that the $5 million would help Manitoba schools install better windows, lighting, and heating. In a letter responding to McKenna's proposal obtained by iPolitics, Manitoba's Education Minister Kelvin Gertson said the province cannot accept another Ottawa intrusion. Well, I guess on the other hand, you could say that Pallister and his gang at least are walking the walk. Everybody else takes the money at the end of the day. They just bitch about it. They're not taking the money. So, whatever. You're sticking to your quote-unquote principles, but you're just hurting your own citizens. Now, more specifically about that, this is from July 18th. This is Winnipeg CTV News, Josh Crabb. We won't be part of a hoax. Manitoba Premier on refusal of federal carbon tax proceeds. Premier Brian Pallister said July 18th the province will not accept an offer from Ottawa to provide roughly $5 million in federal carbon tax proceeds to fund green projects at Manitoba schools in the province because he sees the move as public relations exercise. We won't be part of a hoax. It would be like somebody coming into your house and taking $1,000 off the kitchen table and coming back in an hour and saying, here's a $5, you owe me. That's really what this amounts to. What? I don't know. Minister McKenna is urging Manitoba to reconsider. Pallister said he doesn't feel it's the federal government's place to get involved in an area of provincial authority. Winnipeg School Division Board Trustee and Building and Transportation Chairperson Mark Wassilou, who's also a candidate for the NDP in the upcoming September Manitoba election, called Pallister's decision shocking. He said the money's needed for upgrades to schools. We have a $261 million infrastructure deficit, said Wassilou, who noted 10 schools in the Winnipeg School Division are more than 100 years old and in desperate need of repair. Seven Oaks School Division Superintendent Brian O'Leary said in an email to CTV Winnipeg he hopes the money can still flow directly to schools. Manitoba School Boards Association President Alan Campbell said he's not aware of any formal discussions that have taken place with the federal government. I'm not aware of any precedent where the federal government has approached an individual school board with funding of this nature. Well, isn't that a little hint that, hey, give us a call. We're willing to listen. If your lawyers can make it work, we gonna take the money. What is the point? Own the Libs. Own the Libs. Doug Ford has cost Ontario billions owning the Libs, by canceling cap and trade, by canceling the beer store contract, by canceling renewable energy projects. Own the Libs. Idiots. Where does all this come from? I got lucky. I found what I think is a perfect piece to end this content. It comes from a former guest of The View Up Here, David Kleiman-Haga at albertapolitics.ca. And this is from July 22nd. Why are conservative-run Canadian provinces turning down federal cash? The answer's in the Republican playbook. When Prime Minister Justin Trudeau observed back on April 16th that the Ontario provincial government led by Premier Doug Ford was throwing roadblocks in the way of Ontario municipalities accessing federal money for needed transportation infrastructure, Conservatives responded with angry denials, and not just in Ontario. The Prime Minister told a news conference in Kitchener that over the previous year, Mr. Ford's Conservative government hadn't approved a single infrastructure project for which federal funds were available. Mr. Trudeau called this an example of Mr. Ford's government letting down Ontarians. Ontario Infrastructure Minister Monte McNaughton characterized the PM's comment as a desperate attempt to change the channel, a phrase that was quickly picked up and repeated by conservative echo chambers in media and on social media. But surely this little blip on the political radar, soon forgotten in the news coverage of the Alberta general election results that evening, from which Jason Kenney's UCP emerged triumphant, seems more credible in the light of recent revelations. I speak, of course, of the news that Manitoba's Conservative provincial government has also refused to accept an offer from Ottawa to provide $5 million in federal carbon tax funds to finance green enhancements at elementary and secondary schools. The sum may be small, but as they say, it's not the lousy $5 million. It's the principle of the thing. The offer was part of a broader federal program to use money from Ottawa's carbon tax to upgrade schools in the 4 conservative-run provinces that refused to introduce their own carbon pricing systems and therefore fell under the federal carbon tax legislation, against which Andrew Scheer's federal Conservatives have chosen to campaign. Manitoba's seldom-seen Conservative Premier, Brian Pallister, dismissed the federal offer as a hoax on the grounds the feds want to have a PR campaign to promote the carbon tax, and they're on their own. While the logic of Mr. Pallister's commentary may seem a little strained, as with Mr. Ford's policy in Ontario, the motive is not difficult to figure out. Modern Canadian Conservatives don't seem to have many ideas of their own and take most of their strategies straight out of the Republican Party playbook south of the 49th parallel. As is well known in the age of Donald Trump, American Republicans won't do anything that might help their Democratic Party opponents, even if they have to hurt their own constituents to achieve that goal. Consider the 14 Republican states that refuse to expand the U.S. federal Medicaid program under the Affordable Care Act, in large part because they don't want to do anything for which Democrats could take credit, but also because they have a pathological hatred of the former President Barack Obama's policies in general and his health care reform in particular. The growing rural health crisis in the United States, New York Times economist columnist Paul Krugman wrote in June, is largely a direct result of political decisions. The simple fact is that the Republicans who run Tennessee and other non-expansion states have chosen to inflict misery on many of their constituents, rural residents in particular. Rural voters often complain that national elites don't care about their needs. Well, one way to make people feel hostile towards those elites is to block their access to federal benefits and hope they don't realize who's actually causing their misery. Don't think for a moment the same cynical calculation is on conservative minds in this country, especially with a federal election campaign underway, the economy in pretty good shape, and a Liberal government in Ottawa. It will be no surprise to see Ontario, New Brunswick, and Saskatchewan also turn down similar federal offers, as will Jason Kenney's Alberta too, one imagines, now that it's in the process of joining the self-styled resistance to carbon pricing. After all, carbon taxes are the Obamacare of Canada, an idea invented by the political right, then cynically abandoned and misrepresented when more centrist parties, like the Liberals and the Alberta's NDP, adopted and implemented them. Thank you, David. Excellent. I hope I have helped demonstrate the coast-to-coast coordination on something that is specious to begin with. There could be some places this is called vexatious. You're not going to win. You look at the Constitution. A province is a province is a province. Saskatchewan got told no. Manitoba got told no before they even went to court. Ontario got told no. Figure it out. But they pick our jobs. That's all I've got for blowing hundreds of millions of tax dollars to own the Libs. I guess we could assume in summation that I do not think owning the Libs is a logical or economically sensible thing to do. But, you know, politics. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening to The View Up Here. We'll see you next week. Is there a subject? No. Am I working on some what I think are decent guests? You goddamn right I will. And there will be a Manitoba election show as we get closer to that date. You can guarantee that. Otherwise, that's it for tonight. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next week. Good night.